This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. Hold on to your steering wheel as we're about to hit the road on this week's PreserveCast as we talk with Paull about Baltimore's Stop the Road movement, the historic waterfront community saved, and the highway to nowhere. Detailed in his recently released book, Stop the Road, Stories from the Trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars, Paull will give us a glimpse into the up-close and personal account of Baltimore's 40-year battle over highway plans. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we're excited to be joined by Paull, who is both a city planner and author of a recently released book, Stop the Road, Stories from the Trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars, which obviously has a huge preservation component to it. So we're excited to be talking with him right here in our backyard as PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland. So, Evans, let's talk a little bit about sort of your path into all of this kind of work. Where'd you grow up, and how does one become a city planner? And then we'll get into the road book, but let's talk about your day job here first.
Okay, cool, sure. So I grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, which incidentally was the original destination of the B&O Railroad. So I have this sort of interesting connection from Baltimore to Wheeling, and one of my taglines in writing the Road Wars saga is that I think the Road Wars are basically the most significant controversy and decisions that were made in Baltimore since the building of the B&O Railroad. That's what really attracted me to this topic. Was the significance of it, and that it was kind of an untold story. But you asked about how I became a city planner. I got a master's in city planning at University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and then came to Baltimore in 1973, shortly after getting my degree.
So you were there almost contemporaneously with some aspects of the Road Wars. So you saw this firsthand, and it's interesting because I was excited to be able to get a chance to interview you because the Road Wars, particularly in the preservation community, are almost like apocryphal. Like there's all these different stories and aspects, and was this person really involved, or did they make it for a political play later on and say that they were involved? So I'm excited to kind of talk about this. So the book, again, for those listening who are interested in these aspects of sort of urban decisions of the 20th century and how obviously it impacted historic communities, is called Stop the Road, Stories from the Trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars. So let's kind of deep dive into this a little bit. And obviously we're going to encourage folks to pick up the book, and a link to buy the book will be in the show notes. But give some background on this Stop the Road movement. And maybe even before we get there, what were they trying to stop? You know, let's kind of roll back time to mid 20th century Baltimore. What was on the table? And then we'll talk about the effort to stop it. Okay.
All right. So, there were three highway plans for Baltimore. I-95 coming in from the southwest, I-70 coming in through the west, and I-83 being extended from its current location where it leaves off at Fayette Street, and it was supposed to be extended through what's now Inner Harbor East, then Fells Point and Canton. And somewhat incredibly, the activists, the outsiders, if you will, those who really had no clout, were able to prevail in most of the decisions for all three of those highway segments. And sometimes I read my own words and I'm I sort of can't believe that this actually happened. How often is it that the activists and the outsiders are able to prevail over the political and economic power structure But the highway, there were three of the three highways. One was moved. That was I-95, which was going to enter Baltimore roughly where it does now, but then it was going to veer in a northeasterly direction, cross South Baltimore at Montgomery Street, take out a corner of Federal Hill Park, cross the Inner Harbor on a 14-lane bridge, and then intersect. Yeah, 14 lanes. And then intersect with I-83 in what's now Harbor East. So that highway was moved south to the Fort McHenry alignment, and that was, the first amazing victory, and one that I find especially interesting because it pitted architects and planners against engineers and the political establishment. And then the I-70 was partially defeated. It was supposed to come through Leakin Park. Remember, it terminates now just outside the city, a little ways east of the Beltway. It has that odd turnaround there for the park and ride. That's where it was supposed to go through Leakin Park and then the African American communities of Rosemont and Harlem Park. And the one completely embarrassing part of the highway that did get built was the highway to nowhere. But the rest of the segment was dropped in 1980. And then the third highway that was defeated was I-83, the extension through southeast Baltimore, what's now Harbor East, Fells Point, and Canton. Kind of going 3 for 3 against the political power structure, I was really attracted to telling that story, and it led me to so many interesting people and so many interesting stories that became the core of the Road Wars book.
So for people listening around the country, that maybe they pull out a map, they look at seeing the roads that you talked about and how are they stopped, and there's the nuts and bolts of that and how it impacts Baltimore. But in a broader sense, how did they win, right? And I know that that's a big question, and that's what the book gets into. But in so many communities, they were just steamrolled, bulldozed literally over and just couldn't stop them. Even in communities here in Maryland. I mean, you look at like Cumberland, Maryland on a small scale where the road goes right through downtown. How, and there's so many examples, obviously, across the country of this. How were they successful where others failed? Is there a secret sauce to what was happening in Baltimore?
Well, I think it all kind of came together in about 1966 and 67. Up until that time, the highway opponents were primarily in neighborhood organizations trying to protect their own turf. And around 1966 and 67, organizations started to be formed for the express purpose of fighting the highways. The first was the Relocation Action Movement, which was a coalition of African American organizations on the west side. The second was the Society for the Preservation of Federal Hill and Fells Point, which it has a much larger role now, but at the time was created for the sole purpose of fighting against the highways. And then the organization that Barbara Mikulski started, the Southeast Council Against the Road, kind of was a good counterpart to the Preservation Society. The preservationists were vulnerable to the argument that they were sort of elitists and not necessarily representative of the neighborhoods. And Mikulski's Southeast Council Against the Road involved all the white ethnics and really pulled the rest of Southeast Baltimore into the road fight with the preservationists. And then in 1968, all those groups came together to form the Movement Against Destruction. So we finally had a citywide activist group that was fighting against the highways and Movement Against Destruction, MAD, was an interesting group because they gained a lot of expertise and were able to kind of go toe to toe with the engineers. And so getting back to your original question, finally, how did the Baltimore highway opponents prevail? I think it was because they threw, between all these organizations, they threw so many obstacles at the highways, and the highway planners were forced to accommodate very expensive changes to the highway system, which later proved to be beyond the city's ability to finance. So they were able to engineer delay after delay, and then all these changes, and the delays factored in very prominently because time is money, and from the mid to late 1970s, that was a time of very high interest rates and very high inflation. So highway cost estimates that were made in 1974 were sometimes doubling and tripling 4 years later. So all those delays were part of the key to why the highway system became too expensive for the city to afford.
It's interesting because there's so many parallels. And I mean, obviously, we're talking here in Maryland. There's people listening all across the country. But, you know, in Maryland, there are still highway fights. There's a highway fight going on right now on the Washington, D.C. Beltway that's going to impact historic resources and African-American cemeteries. And there's a fight. And think about the parallels, too. We're in a period of increasing interest rates and high inflation. And, you know, delaying these decisions could end up stymieing the expansion. So kind of looking at the playbook of what happened in Baltimore can be helpful for people who are trying to stop, you know, misguided road expansions and things like that. I'm curious, as a city planner, did this movement, and, you know, you mentioned you came to Baltimore in 1973, how did you perceive what was going on at the time, and had your opinions of it changed over time? Did you think it was the right thing at the time? I'm asking you to kind of be introspective here, but at the time, were you like, no, this is good for Baltimore? But now, I mean, how did you as a city planner evolve along with this?
Yeah. Okay. So if I could back up a little bit on that question. So I came out of planning school in 1973, and in the late 1960s and 1970s, early 1970s, there was an upheaval in city planning that paralleled the upheavals that were affecting pretty much every other segment of society. And in city planning, there was a lot of questioning of our role in serving the interests of those who were already in power, and whether there were many disenfranchised communities that were kind of being left out of that. And prominent in that reconsideration of what our role is was a kind of new theory of advocacy planning. Now, I was not an advocate planner, if you will. I was a generalist planner, and and I did have very strong feelings that city planning needs to be more responsive to those who have largely been left out of the process in the past. But my job was, really a conventional planning job. I was not involved in the highway battles directly. But I mentioned advocacy planning because there were a couple of folks that were involved in a consulting team called the Urban Design Concept Team, who were the embodiment of advocacy planning. And one of the stories that my jaw still drops open when I read my own words is the manner in which the Urban Design Concept Team worked actively against the interests of their clients. Their clients, the City State Oversight Team, the Interstate Division of Baltimore City, and the State Roads Commission were all in favor of that highway that would have gone through Federal Hill, Montgomery Street, crossed the Inner Harbor Bridge, and then the intersection at I-83 with Harbor East, and the manner in which they got that decision changed is just the most amazing example of a consulting team actively working against the interests of their clients that I have ever experienced or read about or heard about. And part of that relates to a guy named Stu Bryant, who was a product of UC Berkeley and was active in the free speech movement. So he had a very liberal left point of view. And he saw his role as providing information to the community, whether his overseers thought that was appropriate or not. And after there was an unfavorable decision on one of their recommendations, it had to do with the Rosemont segment, he started really actively working against the interest of his overseers. He was working with the Anti-Highway Coalition, helping them write their position papers, schooling them on how to, where the weak points were in the environmental impact statements. And he got fired or reassigned several different times, but then he was always brought back because it was a public embarrassment, and he had a constituency in these communities who had gotten used to getting information that they were not supposed to get. So I veered away from your question considerably here, but I think it's it was just a really interesting time that I came out of school, and the whole planning profession was being turned upside down, and the road wars were kind of a case in point.
Why don't we take a quick break here, come back, and then talk about, we talked a lot about what they got right and what they stopped, but maybe what they stopped short of getting right, and where all this is now and what you're working on next. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast. Historic preservation can't happen without skilled tradespeople to perform the work, and there's a critical need right now for those tradespeople. The Campaign for Historic Trades, powered by Preservation Maryland, is working to meet that need by strengthening apprenticeship opportunities within historic trades. In partnership with the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center and Conservation Legacy, the campaign is currently recruiting for NPS Traditional Trades Apprenticeship Program, or TTAP. TTAP is an intensive 20-week apprenticeship that provides young adults the the chance to learn historic trade skills while working on America's most iconic historic sites. Multiple positions are open for the 2022 season at national parks across the country. Visit historictrades.org for more information on TTAP and how to apply today. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. We're back talking with Evans Paull, and we've been talking all about his new book, Stop the Road, Stories from the Trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars. We've been talking about how Baltimore got it right and how they were able to stop it and sort of the unique situation that they found themselves in and were able to prevent this massive road expansion where so many other communities had failed. Do you feel that there was any sort of like missed opportunities, though? I mean, for me, not trying to lead the answer here, but like the glaring missed opportunity is, okay, we didn't build the road, but we also didn't put in any real substantive public transit infrastructure, that we missed that, and that Baltimore has suffered as a result of that. There was a big public infrastructure plan or transit plan as well, and that wasn't really ever fully built out. What happened there? Was it because the effort really was more stopping things? It was harder to get them to build that? Did that not come along because of the road not coming? What happened with transit?
Well, this really gets to Mayor William Donald Schaefer's blind spot. Schaefer was the top advocate for the highway system, going back to his role in city council and then as city council president. And then when he was elected mayor in 1972, he saw his job as to get the highways built, and everyone who was standing in the way of that was his opponent, and they kind of worked. And he regarded them as his enemies, and he did a lot to denigrate the leaders of the anti-highway coalition. But Schaefer, starting in 1973, Congress adopted amendments to what's called the Highway Trust Fund to allow cities to use highway funds for transit instead. And just to our south in Washington, D.C., that's exactly what they did. They shifted $1 billion from building highways to building their metro system. And it was a huge boost to the metro system. Of course, the metro system needed more than $1 billion, but that was a huge change for them. By comparison, Baltimore, because Schaefer was, lock, stock, and barrel, all in for the highways, Schaefer would not entertain any discussion of shifting those funds to transit.
So none. I mean, he wouldn't entertain shifting any of it?
No, not until it became apparent in 1980 that he couldn't afford the highways. And by 1980, say the opportune time to do this was 1973 to 1976. That's the time when we had the gas crisis, the oil crisis, and everyone was really focused on mass transit as an alternative to highways. The Highway Trust had been broken, allowed cities to shift funds to transit. In 1976, that legislation was changed to allow cities to shift funds not only to transit but also to local streets. So and then in 1980 and 1980 to 83, when the city did finally trade in their highway dollars, by then the city had neglected its streets for a decade, and the streets were falling apart, and neighborhoods were clamoring for the streets to be resurfaced much more than for mass transit. We did end up shifting, I believe it was around 300 million to transit, but that was 300 million of 1.1 billion. So it was a whole lot less than what, for example, Washington did in a parallel situation in 1976.
So in a way, does the road war, the fight over it, and the insistence of leaders like Schaefer to go in that direction, is one of the direct results of that the challenging public transportation system that we have, because they were so unwilling to shift that money, they kind of left it on the table hoping they'd build these roads, and then by the time they couldn't build them, then they couldn't build transit either.
Yeah, by then, and inflation had kind of ruined the ability of the city to finance a good subway system. But the metro system was just kind of given lip service by Schaefer and by the state. You know, there was an adopted plan, but there wasn't much money going into it. And then, yeah, as I said, when they finally made the decisions on what to do with the highway funds, it kind of got sprinkled all around. It even went to Interstate 68, which at the time was called the National Freeway. There's a whole interesting story behind that, because it factors into Schaefer running for governor in 1986.
Yeah, and we're still building roads to nowhere. There's I don't know if you're familiar with the U.S. Route 219, a road that goes from Cumberland north that the state has spent a significant amount of money on, and it connects basically to nothing. So we still like building roads. There's something great about road building, and it's something that the preservation community obviously has to pay attention to, because it's so intrinsically connected to historic resources both above and below ground. So we're still dealing with the ramifications of this road war today. What's the postscript on the book? What do you feel about all of this? Was it, obviously stopping the roads, good. The result of its impact on transit, not so good. Getting around Baltimore still challenging because of all of these things, right? You don't have the roads, but you don't have the transit. It's sort of a bad situation. How do we get ourselves out of it? If you have the magic wand to fix Baltimore's transportation issues, how would you actually do it?
Oh, well, you've put me in a position that I'm not really accustomed to being. Maybe you just made me czar of transportation, but
well, you wrote the book on it, so.
I think the Red Line was a huge missed opportunity.
And for people who around the country who don't know, that was a subway and above ground transit system that would have gone to the west of Baltimore and most of the traditionally African American communities.
If Schaefer would have been open-minded to shifting highway funds to transit back in 1973 to 1976, there could have been a really good early version of the Red Line. Remember, the two highway alignments that were dropped were I-70 through West Baltimore and I-83 through Southeast Baltimore, which roughly followed the same corridor as the later proposal for the Red Line. If serious planning had been done for that line based on the possible contingency of Congress adopting this Bust the Trust movement, an early version of the Red Line could have been the trade-in for the dropped highway funds. And I think it would have made a huge difference to West Baltimore. Would have made a huge difference to Baltimore in general, because transit has a centralizing effect on land use and density, whereas highways have a decentralizing effect on land use and growth. But in West Baltimore in particular, one of the things that is really lacking is transportation to suburban jobs. So,
right.
I mean, a good transit system would have bolstered downtown Baltimore as a job center, but that probably wouldn't have stopped the decentralization of jobs to the suburbs. And there are huge obstacles to people getting from these inner city neighborhoods like West Baltimore, Harlem Park, and so on, to those suburban job centers. And if an early version of the Red Line were built, a lot of that problem could have been solved with access to Woodlawn on the west side and on the east side over toward the industrial centers, and then linking up with the later built North Central line, therefore providing access to the Hunt Valley Job Center and the Airport Job Center. I think it could have been a huge difference maker for West Baltimore.
So, I mean, I think for the preservationists listening, the value in this conversation is sort of thinking through. I mean, obviously, these transportation projects not only would have benefited the communities, but obviously also, I mean, there's rich historic fabric all throughout those areas that have a better chance of being invested in, taken care of, restored, if their people can get in and out of those communities. And the transportation desert that it is directly impacts those historic resources. So fascinating conversation. And it's also interesting as a Marylander, and there's so much, worship of William Donald Schaefer to hear. Obviously there's a lot of important counterpoints to that, but this is one that doesn't come up as much. And I think is important to remember as people kind of think about his legacy as both mayor and governor. What are you working on next? What's the next story you're going to tell?
Oh, well, when I retired in, I don't know, roughly 2017, 2018, and my business kind of ebbed away and I started writing the book, it didn't seem like much of a retirement because I shifted right from working full-time to writing full-time. So now I'm going to, kind of really retire, and I've got one grandson and 3 kids, and do all those things, do some traveling, maybe write a baseball blog. I don't know that there's anything else that I'm going to be doing in the city planning area.
Well, we'll keep an eye out in case you are, and we will put a link in the show notes to the book so that people can pick it up. Definitely a good read for anybody interested in preservation and community planning and advocacy, and how you stop bad ideas and how that all plays out in a community as diverse and complicated and beautiful as Baltimore. Thanks for joining us today, Evans. It was great to have you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.